Good afternoon again, Church. Pastor Keven Newsome here, continuing the study on generational ministry in the church, the generational influence of the different generations in the church, past, present, and future, and how that impacts the church and how we can prepare for those things. And we are continuing now with session 5. And in this session, I'll be going over an overview very quickly of the generational characteristics. The generational characteristics that we've gone over the past couple of sessions with the five really major generations still in the church. And then we're going to look at some generational relationships, how the generations act, understanding the generations and how they think and how they act just by themselves is only part of the puzzle. It's also equally important to understand how those generational characteristics interact with one another, where we find points of harmony, where we find points of contention. This is where the true application begins to be found, and where most of our issues occur in the church as these generations interact with one another and these characteristics collide with each other. So we're going to talk about some of these generational characteristics after we do a brief overview of. We're going to look at the relationships after we do a brief overview of the characteristics. So, really quick here, again, is the dividing line, the timeline of the different generations. We have 5 active generations in the church right now. The silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Generation Z. There may be a few GI generations still in our churches, but they are mostly inactive. And the following generation after Gen Z are infants, they're children right now, so they are not influential in the church. So moving to our overview, so this is a chart that basically covers all of the things I talked about with the characteristics in the past couple of sessions, past 3 sessions I believe. So I just want to go over this if you want to look at them side by side, the worldviews of each one: objective theism, individualistic theism, postmodern respect, postmodern inclusion, post-Christian autonomy. There are major characteristics. These are important to remember and important to keep in mind as we move forward with these interactions. Silent generation, of course, is stability. Baby boomers, control. Generation X, respect. Millennials, inclusion. Gen Z, security and comfort. We have their truth statements here, their strengths and their weaknesses. If you would like to take a moment to pause, to refresh in your mind these different things that I covered in the previous sessions, please feel free to do that now. Moving on, we're going to look at the interactions. So there's two main categories of interactions I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk about the points of harmony, and I'm going to talk about the points of contention. There are more points of harmony than there are contention. There's only 2 major points of contention that we need to really bear in mind when dealing with generational ministry. The first point of harmony is the silent generation and the baby boomers. They find common ground even though their early relationship was strained. You remember the baby boomers are the ones who kind of went wild for a little while and wanted to become masters of their own destiny. They left the church, but they came back. They came back and returned, and so the silences see that as this change within the boomers. So we see the major characteristics of silences is stability. The major characteristics of the boomers are control. Control being a form of self-central stability. These 2 generations identify and work well with each other, and the silences are willing to allow the boomers to help create their stability and provide that for them. The boomers are very happy to do that for the parent generation, a parent generation that they sort of had some rocky relationship with in the beginning. So the boomers now have like a spiritual respect for the silences who stayed the course in church and in spirituality. So these 2 generations get along really well. Silences and Gen Xers are another generation that gets along really well. And generally speaking, the grandparent-grandchild relationship between generations is usually pretty strong. So the silences sympathize with the Gen Xers who feel disconnected by the boomers. So the boomers sort of overcorrected when they became parents, and the Gen Xers kind of suffered for that, and were sort of lamented as a second lost generation, a worthless generation, and were really put down on by society, and so Gen X has been trying to really fight that and prove themselves and get some respect. And so the grandparent generation, the silences, they sympathize because they saw that their parents, well, they weren't that great either when they were teenagers and young people, and the boomers turned it around. So they're more likely to give Gen X the benefit of the doubt, to wait and see if they'll turn it around as well, like Gen X is trying to prove themselves that they can do. Silences will allow Gen Xers to produce change so long as it doesn't threaten their stability, and Gen Xers don't really want to destabilize their grandparents. They want to cling to their grandparents since the grandparents have given them lots of attention, lots of respect they didn't get from their parents, and acceptance. So Gen Xers want to protect that relationship. However, harmonious relationships between silences and Gen X might not extend too far past blood relationships. So when you get outside blood relationships, Gen X may take a sort of a baby boomer role with the silent generation for the elder Gen X, and they might sort of take a millennial role with the silent generation for a younger Gen X. And so outside, you may want to take a look at those relationships, which I've already talked about, silences and boomers, which get along. But the millennials and silences, that's one of those points of contention. So outside of blood relationships, you might see young Gen X experience some contention with silent generation, much the same way that millennials will. Boomers and millennials, this is another grandparent-grandchild relationship. Excuse me. This is a point of harmony, but there's a new twist that we've seen in the past couple of years sort of developing. I'll get that on the bottom of the screen here. Boomers are quick to embrace their grandchildren because there was a strained relationship with their Gen X children. Millennials are more likely to join the boomer-led family business when Gen X has chosen to take another career path. We see Gen X wanting to forge their own path, wanting to make their own identity, and prove themselves away from their parents, and so they're leaving the family business and they're doing their own thing. But millennials are being brought in by the boomers to take over the family business, and they're happy to do that. Boomers want a good relationship with their grandchildren, so they'll go above and beyond to prove themselves. Now, here's the twist. Excuse me. We have a trend. You've probably heard the OK Boomer term that's been trendy among millennials here recently. And this is a term that is used to dismiss or mock boomers who have stopped trying to stay relevant. In the eyes of millennials, it was created in response to boomers who are expressing frustration that millennials don't demonstrate the same worldview as the baby boomers do. So there's two sides to it. The boomers are frustrated with the millennials. The millennials feel like some of these boomers are no longer trying to stay relevant, and so this whole OK Boomer back and forth between boomers and millennials has developed. It is largely seen now as a derogatory type of remark. It's pretty rude to use this in conversation now, but when you really look at what's going on with this movement, it demonstrates millennials still trying they still have a desire for the boomers, their grandparent generation, to understand the world they live in. So they're still trying to explain. They want the baby boomers boomers to come along. They want them to get on board. They want to keep that relationship. And so, but there's been some frustration that's been built up right there. I think this will largely go away. I think it was just a temporary thing, and we're going to see some of this settle out. Gen X and Millennials, another point of harmony. There's not a lot of difference between young Gen Xers and the older Millennials. We see we talked about that Xennial micro generation in between, the dividing line between these two. So these younger Gen X tend to act a lot like Millennial. The closer they get to that dividing line, or even over the line if they're still within that 5 years, the more Millennial they're going to behave. The biggest difference to define these two and their characteristics and how they interact is going to be how they were raised. Were Millennials raised by a baby boomer parents, or were they raised by Gen X parents? That makes a huge difference in the parenting style. Boomers and Gen X parent completely differently. Gen X wanted to sort of overcompensate in the way that boomers treated them, and so Gen X are very relaxed way in the way they parent. Gen X and Millennials, their core values work very well together. Gen Xers value respect. Millennials value inclusion. Though that's not really the same thing, they can go together. So the strain between these generations comes when the friction between respect and inclusion, between this friction between respect and inclusion. They don't mean the same thing. Just because you respect somebody's ideas doesn't mean you want to include their ideas. They can work together. Certainly there's some similarities there, but any friction between Gen X and Millennials is probably going to come from this, where they will have trouble expressing themselves. So one of the things, before I move on to some of our points of contention, one of the things I did in the little paper back that I wrote that you can get, that's got all this information, is I presented a sort of little tongue-in-cheek scenario of choosing dinner between the two generations, and how the conversation might go between choosing to make tacos for dinner or to have chicken for dinner. And so if I'm going to back up to silence and boomers. So if we have silences and boomers, and you can see how they get along and their characteristics, and you think about the stability and of the silences and the control of the boomers, the conversation might go like this. The silent might say, it's taco night, let's make tacos. And the boomer says, I want chicken. Chicken's better. The silent says, but we always have tacos on this night. Why should we change? That's that stability. And the boomer says, now, conceding to the parent generation, but they still want to have control. The boomer might say, okay, how about I make you chicken tonight, and I'll make tacos tomorrow. The silent feels like they've been heard. Their stability has been valued, so they concede the change. We move into silences and Gen Xers. Silences, stability. Gen Xers, respect. Those are the major characteristics. The silent might say, it's taco night, let's make tacos. And the Xer says, but I want chicken. So there's a defensive tone. There's a passive-aggressive cry for respect. The silent says, we always have tacos on this night. Why should we change? Again, stability, expressing their stability. And the Xer says, because I haven't had chicken in a long time. So the silent, suspecting that the Gen Xers' parents never gave them chicken, they concede. They say, okay, if you want chicken, I'll fix you chicken. So that would be a conversation between the silents and the Gen Xers. Boomers and Millennials, they were to have the same conversation. The boomer would say, it's taco night, I'll make tacos. Notice they're taking control right away. The millennial says, I'd rather have chicken. The boomer says, tacos are better, we're having tacos. The millennial says, what about chicken tacos? That way we both get what we want. Notice that inclusion. The millennial is trying to include the ideas. The boomer wants to be in control. The millennial wants to include the ideas. And the boomer, being eager to please their grandchild relationship, says, chicken tacos it is. I'll make chicken tacos. They keep the control, and they pacify their millennial grandchildren. Gen X and millennials. Gets a little tense, maybe a little bit here. The Xer will say, it's taco night, I want tacos, and the millennial says, I think I'd rather have chicken. The Xer says, you can have chicken if you want, but I want tacos. So notice there's that respect for the other idea, but there's a lack of inclusion. The millennial says, why don't we make chicken tacos? So there's this attempt at inclusion. And the Xer says, okay, we can do chicken tacos, but I'm doing beef too because I want beef. We can do both. So it's a solution to the problem depending on the personalities. It can be positive or negative. They might get to the point where the millennial really wanted chicken and not chicken tacos, and now the Xer is cooking two things, and it might as well have been chicken and beef tacos. Instead, they're getting something they didn't really want, and the Xer now feels like they have to do twice as much work to make the millennial happy, and neither of them understand why. Nobody's happy. They have problems voicing how they truly feel. It'll either all come out and be resolved to the satisfaction of both, or they'll internalize it and build a chip on their shoulders, and it'll come out anyway. Communication is the key between Gen Xers and millennials. If they can communicate, they'll generally work well together. So now we're going to move on to the points of contention. Two major points of contention that we want to talk about. Boomers and Generation X. I call this the generational wound. So the digital revolution created a new world between these generations. Postmodernism gave Generation X a new worldview. Boomers and society in general lamented the future of Gen X. If Gen X parents shared society's view, then Gen X grew up resenting their parents, wanting to leave as quickly as possible, create their own lives. Xers grew up trying to prove their worth and trying to earn the respect of their parents. So Xers and Boomers are quick to get into conflict. They're quick to butt heads. We see Boomers are refusing to pass the torch on to their Gen Xers. They just don't feel like the Gen Xers can handle it. They don't feel like the Gen Xers have honored the traditions of their families, and so they're preferring to pass these torches on to their millennial grandchildren. Xers are seeking respect and success away from their parents, and so they see establishments run by baby boomers as hostile. Now, this is important, especially when we talk about churches, and we're going to get into some church strategy when it comes to these generational interactions later in a later session. But think about it for a second. When you see a church that is mostly populated by silent generation and baby boomers, you see very little Generation X involved. Where Generation X is involved is going to be churches that are mostly populated by younger generations. On the flip side, we do see millennials coming into these older populated churches and being able to thrive in there. But those Xers see these establishments and even churches run by baby boomers. Baby boomers are in charge. They see them as hostile, and they will go somewhere else. It's a real challenge for churches. Before we move on, let's talk about dinner. Dinner is going to get messy between the baby boomer and the Gen Xer. The baby boomer is going to say, it's taco night, I'm making tacos. He's exerting that control. And the Xer says, but I don't want tacos, I want chicken. The boomer says, tacos are better. We're having tacos, enforcing the control. The Xer says, why do you think tacos are better? I think chicken is better. I want chicken. There's that cry for respect. He wants the baby boomer to respect his idea. The baby boomer, it doesn't matter what you want, we're having tacos. So there's no reciprocal respect. There's no respect given from the baby boomer to the Gen Xer. There's this planting of control. It's my way, and I'm not going to change it. And so the Xer blows up. you never listen to me, you never blah 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 blah, and runs off, storms off, and there's this huge argument, and big conflict between the baby boomer and Xer over something as simple as picking dinner. Of course, these dinner examples are oversimplifications. I hope you know that. They're just examples, just a way to present to you how these generations might think differently when trying to make a simple decision. Second point of contention is going to be between the silences and the millennials. So the formative years of these generations were vastly different. The greatest innovation of the early years of the silent generation was the microwave. The millennials have never known a time when they did not have a cell phone or internet. Two completely different worlds. To say these generations don't understand each other is an understatement. Silences view millennials as excessive, selfish, technologically dependent. They think if something were to happen and all this technology were to suddenly disappear or go away, millennials wouldn't even be able to feed themselves. Millennials view silences as old-fashioned, out of touch, and technologically resistant. So millennials have adopted the technology, and they recognize that the technology is not going away. The technology is redundant. It doesn't. Something may happen in one area, but it's going to be compensated in another area. So they're not worried about their technological dependence. So very, very conflicting views of the world. Silences value stability, so they're reluctant to adapt modern technology and modern ways of doing things. Millennials live with it every day. It's part of their lifestyle. Millennials have a postmodern inclusion worldview that clashes with silence's desire to maintain the status quo and to maintain stability. So a millennial wants to include worldviews. Truth is relative. What you believe is important to me. But a silence wants beliefs and truths to stay stable, and don't understand that the postmodern way of thinking at all. So there's this point of contention. I call it the oddity gap. When we get to dinner, it just gets awkward. So silent says it's taco night. Let's make tacos. And the millennial think I'd rather have chicken. Silent says, but we always have tacos on this night. Why should we change? That's the stability. The millennial doesn't understand what the big deal is about change, says, why not? What does it hurt to change? Silence says, because this is the way we do things. It's the way we've always done things. So the millennial offers a compromise, offers that inclusion. What about chicken tacos? Will you consider that? The silent stares at him, wondering how chicken tacos solves the problem at all, because they were talking about chicken or tacos. What do chicken tacos have to do with anything? Just says, that's not the same thing. I thought you wanted chicken. And the millennial's like, I do. It's just, I thought, and it just kind of gets awkward because they don't really know how to communicate. So that's a point of contention. We see this happening as the silences are aging in our churches, and millennials are beginning to take more and more responsibility in leadership roles. The silences are beginning to allow millennials to create change, so long as their stability is maintained. And I think successful churches have found ways to keep some form of stability for their aging congregation. And I believe millennials value that because they value the inclusion of ideas, even traditional ideas that they believe are stable. They see these silences ideas as valuable. Even if it's not reciprocated, the millennial still values that and wants to include that. So we're seeing some positive interactions, some positive results between silences and millennials in the churches. All right, so new material from what you'll find in the book if you happen to get the book. Generation Z, of course, there's still not a whole lot known about Generation Z and how they're going to impact the church, and how they're going to interact with other generations, and what this is going to look like. I'm not even going to try to give you my dinner analogy with this generation, or even spend a lot of time parsing them against other generations. But we're going to make some inferences. based on what we know from other generation relationships. So the grandparent-grandchild relationships are usually strong. So Gen Z will likely get along with their grandparents' generation, which might be baby boomers, it might be Gen X. Both boomers and Gen X are potential grandparents for Generation Z. However, great-grandparent relationships may be strained. So if a Gen Z baby boomer is a Gen Z great-grandparent, that relationship may be a little awkward. And certainly the relationship between Gen Z and the silent generation is going to be awkward. Um, Most of the children of millennials, most of these are children of millennials, and millennials are very protective parents. Um, so we see that there tends to be a swing uh, in parenting styles. When one generation is overprotective, then the following generation tends to underprotect their children. Millennials are more overprotective, and so we might suspect Gen Z to become underprotective parents in the future. Millennial parents tend to put more trust in their children than other adults. Older Generation Z might have Gen X parents. Gen X parents have high expectations, and they're generally really encouraging and accepting. They tend to have a more relaxed style of parenting, but they do have that high expectation on their children. And they try really hard not to parent like their boomer parents. So the children of Gen X parents, the Gen Z children of Gen X parents, might be a little more free-spirited, you might say, than the children of millennials. When we look at the generational cycles, I mentioned generational cycles, I believe it was in session 1, and we're going to get to some more of that in some following sessions. There's a 4-generation cycle. Every 4th generation, the cycle repeats itself, and we see that both Generation Z and Silences are artist generations, so they represent the same cycle. So as such, some of their generational relationships may develop similarly to the way the generation relationships develop with the silent generation. They are likely to underprotect their children, as I mentioned earlier, and have likely to have some early strained relationships with their children. We see that the silent generation underprotected the baby boomer generation. The silent generation had some early strained relationships with the baby boomer generation, and we might see something similar develop as Generation Z becomes parents. So that's just speculation based on the generational cycle theory and then what we've seen in the previous cycle of the same generation cycle. Right, so that takes us to this. If you want a printed version, here it is. I will gladly send the PDF to you for free. And let me just say that this was 3 years ago. It does not include a lot of this new information on Generation Z. It is due for a new edition, which I'll probably try to work on later in the year. All right, thank you for joining us. That concludes session 5. And I will return next week with session 6. Thank you for watching. Have a blessed day.